I used to think betrayal would come with warning signs, slammed doors, screaming fights, cold silences that echoed louder than words. But in my marriage, it came dressed in laughter, late-night whispers, and the smell of salsa simmering on the stove. She thought I was blind, thought I was too distracted with my cooking and my work to notice the way her eyes lingered on her phone longer than on me. But the truth is I noticed everything. And the night I overheard her squealing on the phone, begging her lover to set her on fire, that was the moment I stopped being her husband and started becoming her executioner. She had no idea she'd just written her own ending, and I was going to make sure the show was unforgettable. We were married 7 years. Long enough for our words to have calluses, long enough for our jokes to get familiar and then old. There were bright stretches, honeymoon summers, that apartment with the crooked balcony, nights of cheap beer and better conversation, moments that still fired up a tenderness I could taste if I let myself. But there had been cracks for longer than either of us admitted. They started as tiny things, missed movie nights, the occasional evasive answer about what time she'd be home. Then they got bolder and softer all at once, late meetings that smelled faintly like perfume not ours, laughter in the other room when I knew I was the only one supposed to be there, a déjà vu of intimacy that belonged to someone else. At first I blamed my own busy brain. I told myself I was reading meaning into shadows, that the loneliness married me before she did. I told myself that marriages sink or float based on forgiveness and commitment, and I was committed. But commitment isn't blind. Commitment keeps receipts. Cooking the salsa that Sunday felt like ritual. I liked the alchemy of it: crushed tomatoes, jalapenos, a fistful of cilantro, the smell of garlic bloomed in olive oil. I made it the way my grandmother taught me, slow and deliberate, tasting and adjusting, coaxing flavors the same way you coax honesty out of a quiet person. The kitchen was my refuge, the stove made me precise. While the sauce reduced, I chopped onions, listened to the small domestic music of our apartment, distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the television barely audible in the living room, and I felt a small, grateful peace. She was upstairs, she said, finishing client notes. She always had work on Sundays now, sometimes work stretched into nights. I didn't press. Pressing invites excuses. The first clear sign came in the bathroom. I walked in to find a lipstick I didn't recognize on the rim of our sink, a pale rose that didn't match anything she owned. I stood there with my hand on the towel rack and felt that old mechanical press of a heart that's not quite sure which mode to choose, curiosity or caution. I wiped it off with a corner of a paper towel, because what else do you do with small evidence? You file it away in the mind's cabinet and then go on. The salsa hissed in the pan, I tasted it, added a splash of lime. There were other hints that felt too small to be called evidence: hair on the pillow that wasn't hers, a receipt for a coffee shop 2 blocks away with a time stamp that meant nothing until it was paired with an oddness. Her breath one night, when she came to bed, smelled not like the citrus soap she used but like someone else's cologne. She joked it off, said we were making assumptions. She smiled that smile that used to pull me in, and for a week, I let myself believe the smile was real. I caught a pattern I couldn't ignore because it was a pattern of absence. She would text at odd hours, and then, when I innocently asked if everything was okay, she'd look at me like I'd asked her to explain calculus. She became cagey about her phone, turning the screen down when she sat across from me, closing the laptop with a little too much force when I came into the room. At dinner she would sometimes go quiet, and when I asked what she was thinking she would wave a hand and say, nothing. Just tired. Her tiredness seemed to have a schedule that did not include me. I tried not to become the detective in my own life. I told myself to trust. Trust used to be logical, measurable: years of shared bills and rent receipts, the birth of a dog, holiday photos. But trust is also a muscle, and mine had been unused. So I used small, safe curiosity, things that felt like keeping a diary of our lives rather than spying on them. I checked the mileage occasionally on her car when she left it overnight. I kept an eye on our shared calendar. I learned her laugh again to be able to separate it from the other laugh I heard. I noticed the way she angled herself away from me when she sat on the couch, the way her thumb rubbed the screen of her phone as if soothing a thought. The day before the salsa incident, she came home later than she'd said. She appeared in the doorway 10 minutes after I'd called. Her hair was up in a messy bun, work glasses gone, cheeks flushed. She kissed me quick and said, "Sorry. Late meeting." Later, when I found a receipt in her coat pocket, dinner for two at a restaurant across town, time stamped at an hour when she said she was in a meeting, I felt a coldness like someone had opened a freezer door in my chest. I didn't confront her that night. I don't know why. Maybe I was saving my questions for a time that felt more auspicious, more controlled. Maybe confrontation felt like burning down a house when I only had matches. There's a peculiar thing about suspicion, it makes you notice the things you used to ignore. I started to catalog her small freedoms. There were the texts she deleted. There were sudden wardrobe choices that were new to her: low-cut tops, a necklace she never wore before, a perfume that smelled like summer and risk. She would come home with hair smelling faintly of someone else. She would say, "It's nothing," and then I would watch that nothing flit into a corner and curl into a secret. People who cheat aren't always stone-faced villains. They are clever with their absences. They laugh more when they are nervous. They become hyper-aware of how they present themselves. She started to care about photogenic angles. She'd ask me to take her picture and then not post it for days. She took selfies that were thoughtful and small in a way she never used to be. The smallest things were the loudest, and the loudest thing was her phone. I should say I didn't become violent with the idea. Violence seemed theatrical and costly and, in a way, too easy. I was not a man of sudden explosions. My anger, when it came, would be colder and more precise. I like to think that's a better kind of control. I reminded myself of that even as I catalogued receipts and traced times and marked patterns on a calendar in my head. That Sunday, the apartment smelled like tomatoes and onion and possibility. The salsa simmered and thickened, a slight crust formed on the bottom and I scraped it with a wooden spoon. The rhythm of cooking steadied me. I put the radio on low, some old station that played the songs from when we first fell in love. It made me remember us in Pastel Way late nights, too cheap coffee, and a mattress on the floor. I chopped a lime and squeezed it into the pan. The acid brightened the sauce like honesty, I thought, about as ironically as you can imagine. She texted, a little heart, and a message that said, "Coming soon X." I read it and felt a speechless pain then irritation. I sent back a thumb up and the classic, "Need help?" No reply. The crescendo on the radio swelled into a chorus I'd heard 100 times. I stirred. The apartment had that summer light that hit the kitchen window in a thin, lazy stream. I could see the pillow on the couch, the faint imprint where she'd been lying earlier. I could see the dust motes spinning in the sunlight, the tiny, ordinary particles of a life. I liked the pattern the steam made on the windowpane, because patterns were familiar and forgave human error. There's a silly comfort in routine that's hard to explain unless you're someone who has spent years building a life with another person. She came down eventually, not with the hurried gait of someone late for a meeting, but with the slow, confident saunter of someone who had somewhere else to be and was weighing whether to stay. She walked through the doorway and paused as if deciding, the way you do when you stand over a dessert and debate whether to eat it. She smelled different, not bad, not wrong, but layered. There was that same faint cologne I'd noticed the week before, a whisper of a cigarette even though she didn't smoke. She leaned on the counter and watched me like she was watching a trick. "Smells great," she said, smiling with a tightness I'd long ago learned to read. "Want some?" I said, lifting the spoon for her to sample. She took it and closed her eyes, the way one does when remembering a better, smaller habit. For a second, something in her face softened and I could have believed in repair. But she set the spoon down and checked her phone. Sometimes people think cheaters always text from shadowed corners, sometimes they call. She started to take calls on speaker, laughing too loud at jokes I could not hear, turning the screen away from me when she did. I thought it was caution. I thought maybe I had become intolerably suspicious. I told myself to breathe, to trust, to be a person who could live with doubt and not let doubt dictate the story. An hour later, when I turned to bring another bowl to the table, she answered the phone and moved toward the bedroom. Her voice dropped low and then rose, and I heard something I wasn't supposed to. That was the first thing. Guilt has a voice that sometimes forgets to hide. People on the other end of illicit relationships often speak louder than they intend because they are trying to convince themselves. She said a name in that voice, soft and possessive. I paused with the wooden spoon in my hand, the spoon suspended in mid-air, and listened. At first it was nonsense with content flirtation, a laugh. I told myself I was overreacting, that possibilities are not proof. But then she began to speak of plans, of meeting, of wanting a feeling that felt like combustion, dangerous, thrilling, and warm. It was the way she said it that made my palms go cool. There was an excitement in her voice that did more than betray, it celebrated. I went to the bedroom door very quietly, as if I were approaching a sleeping animal. The knob was warm under my hand. The apartment felt too loud, the radio in the kitchen like an accusation. I stood on the threshold and watched her profile in the light from the hallway. She had the phone pressed to her ear, she was gesturing with the other hand, eyes closed, smiling the way people smile when they invent conversations for themselves. I took a breath and the breath felt like a thin rope, holding me together. "Really?" said a voice on the other end, male, close, amused. "Tell me what you want." She laughed, a sound I knew and didn't. "I want you to set my ass fire," she said, and the words hurt because they were not a metaphor she'd ever used with me. They were precise and outrageous and intimate in a way that punched through the kitchen door like a thrown stone. I had time, in a single breath, to imagine a dozen things and then set all of them aside. I didn't hear the rest. The sentence landed and then everything narrowed. My mouth tasted like metal. The spoon sagged in my hand like something I had forgotten how to hold. For a second my mind tried to translate what I had heard into something softer. She was joking, she was hyperbolic. But the tone, eager, breathy, delighted, didn't allow that easy forgiveness. She was not talking about a hypothetical. The language she used belonged to surrender, to letting someone else claim you in a way that meant you were not theirs anymore. I stood there at the door, a stranger in my own house. The salsa on the stove was forgotten, bubbling and fragrant. I should have done the simple human thing, walked in, put an arm around her, asked a question. Instead, a strange numbness overspread my body, like the first cold when you jump into deep water. My hands steadied. My thoughts clarified into the geometric shapes they take when the brain is building a plan. I catalogued the facts, the voice, the words, the time, the way she leaned her shoulder against the closet door. I catalogued the absence that had crept into us and now named it. She said the name again, softer this time, a petal of a name. The person on the other end murmured something indulgent. She answered with a flirty, "Yes, I will," and then the call ended with a click that sounded like the closing of a book. When she came out of the room she was the same woman who had been in the doorway earlier, composed, smiling, the trace of perfume fresh. She kissed my cheek and said, "Dinner smells amazing." There was a domesticity in her voice that mocked the private theater I had just seen. I handed her a bowl. She asked about my day. I asked a question about the radio, and she answered without missing a beat. She moved through the apartment like someone who hasn't tasted the knife in the other's hand. I ate half my dinner in silence and the other half in the company of a very particular, roiling thought. Something had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer merely about suspicion or curiosity. It was about a fact I could not unknow. The words she had used were a lit match. And the thing it could set ablaze was everything we had been. I kept my voice calm because rage murmurs before it screams. I kept my face civil because a clean hand writes the more dangerous notes. That night I did not sleep. I lay in bed in the dark and watched the ceiling like an interrogator. I thought about the first week we were together, how everything was new and big and fearless. I thought about the small ways we had eroded each other, offhand cruelty, neglect, assumptions, and wondered whether love had been sloppy or whether our hands had just learned to let one another go. I thought about what I would do next, and each possibility felt like a hinge that could swing into disaster. By morning the salsa was cold in the container I had put in the fridge. Life, of course, continued in its ridiculous way. Emails needed answering, the dog needed walking, the city continued to move like nothing had happened. But for me, something had been lit that could not be put out. It was not a burning in the cinematic sense, it was a slow, patient ignition knowledge that would become the engine of whatever came next. I had heard the line that changed everything. She had spoken it without thinking of me. And the fact that she had asked someone else to set her on fire settled in my chest like a promise I could not accept. When you discover that the person who shared your bed has been sharing a secret bed with someone else, the first instinct is to confront. But confrontation is immediate and loud, it risks irreparable rupture. I wanted something else. I didn't know what that was yet. I only knew the taste of the words, how they sat like a coal. I rolled that coal in my fingers until it burned a shape I could recognize. So I began to watch, silently, like a man taking inventory of a house he meant to keep. I noted the times she left, the messages she didn't send, the new perfume in the bathroom cabinet. I started to keep small records, times, dates, the cadence of her lies. I became exact because exactness gives you power. That Sunday, as the city moved on, a different sort of movement started in me. I would not be blind. I would not be naive. I would build a case one small careful step at a time until the moment I could decide what kind of show I wanted to give her. The thing about living with someone is that you know the punctuation of their life, when they laugh, when they lie, when they sneak. You collect these little marks and sometimes you press them into a story. I had just found the final line. It matched nothing I had expected, and everything I feared. The match had been struck. Now the question was what I would do with the flame. The night of the phone call became a partition in my life. Before, I was a husband who suspected; after, I was a man who knew. Knowledge doesn't always roar, sometimes it sits quietly, like a locked box you carry everywhere. That night, I carried her words into sleep. I carried them into the shower the next morning, into my coffee cup, into the shuffle of papers at work. Her laugh echoed under my skull like a tune I couldn't turn off. Set me on fire. I didn't confront her. Confrontation ends the game too quickly. People think fury is strength, but fury is sloppy. Precision, patience saith its strength. A hunter doesn't scream at the deer. He waits until the deer forgets he's there. She thought I hadn't heard. That was her first mistake. The morning after, I watched her through the lens of my new knowledge. She moved with her usual confidence, hair damp from the shower, coffee mug in hand. She kissed me on the cheek, said, "Don't forget to defrost the chicken," and smiled like nothing in the world had shifted. I smiled back, but I was watching the cracks. I was cataloging them. Her phone was on the counter, screen face down as always. I studied its placement, the subtle tension in her shoulders when I moved too close. She wasn't careless yet. But carelessness always comes. Cheaters get greedy. They believe they are smarter than time itself. On my way to work, I replayed her words like a recording, "I want you to set my ass on fire." They weren't just obscene. They were his. That phrase didn't belong in our vocabulary. It belonged to someone else, to a world I wasn't invited to. And she had spoken it with devotion, with a hunger that told me she hadn't been improvising. It was a ritual phrase, something rehearsed, repeated, fed. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched. Then I loosened them, reminded myself, this wasn't anger. This was evidence. Evidence demands discipline. That week, I began my inventory. Monday, she said she had to stay late at the office. She came home 2 hours after dark, smelling faintly of tobacco smoke. Her excuse, a coworker had stepped outside and she joined him. She doesn't smoke. She never liked it. Wednesday, a new blouse. Low neckline. I asked if it was new, she smiled and said, had it for years. Lie. I knew her closet the way a sailor knows his ropes. That blouse hadn't existed yesterday. Friday, her phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. while she was in the shower. I glanced. A name I didn't recognize. The preview line read, "I can't stop thinking about last night." I memorized the name, the shape of it. Didn't touch the phone. Didn't leave a trace. Hunters don't spring traps too soon. By Sunday, the salsa pan felt different under my hands. The ritual had soured. The smell of cilantro reminded me of her whispering into the phone, giving herself away while I stirred tomatoes in silence. I didn't taste the sauce that night. I fed it to her and watched her lick her lips as if the flavor hadn't changed. She said, "Perfect as always." I almost laughed. Cheaters underestimate silence. They think if you haven't accused them, you don't know. Silence is not ignorance. Silence is the sound of sharpening. I began making small tests. Subtle things. I moved her phone charger from the bedroom to the kitchen one evening and said nothing. She panicked when she couldn't find it, eyes wide for half a second before she smoothed her face and plugged in. I noted it. Attachment to secrecy. Reliance on tools. Another night, I asked her what she wanted to do next weekend. She said, maybe a movie. I agreed and suggested Saturday. She hesitated, checked her phone under the table, then said, actually Sunday's better. The pause before the correction was all I needed. Saturday was already booked. By who, I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Her lies were becoming a rhythm, and I was learning the beat. The strange thing about betrayal is how it sharpens the world. My senses heightened. I noticed details I would have once dismissed, a faint crease in her blouse, the way she double-checked her reflection before leaving, the quick change in her tone when she answered a text. Each detail was a brushstroke painting her disloyalty. And in me, something else was growing. Not sadness. Sadness is passive. This was something colder. A kind of curiosity. I wanted to see how far she would go. How careless she would become. That line she had given her lover set me on fire became my talisman. Not because of its erotic stupidity, but because it revealed her. It was her unguarded self. It told me she was willing to risk everything for a thrill. It told me she had already surrendered to him in ways she would never admit. Every time she laughed too loudly on the phone, I heard that line under her breath. Every time she slipped out late, I imagined her repeating it in another man's ear. It didn't make me burn with rage. It made me smile, faintly, like a man reading a book whose ending he already knows. I began preparing the ground. Nothing obvious. Just small adjustments. I offered to cook more often, which gave me time in the kitchen where I could overhear her phone calls. I started keeping receipts, but not hers, mine. Proof of where I was, what time, what I bought. I was building my alibi, my narrative. I told her I had a project at work that would keep me late some evenings. It didn't. I wanted to see how she filled the empty spaces. It worked. One Thursday, I returned home earlier than I said I would. I parked down the street, cut the engine, and watched the windows. At 9:14 p.m., a silhouette entered. Not hers. Taller. Male. He stayed 40 minutes. When I finally walked up the drive, the lights in the living room had just gone dark. She opened the door a minute later, hair slightly mussed, cheeks too pink. She smiled. "You're early." I smiled back. Traffic was light. She kissed me quickly, almost mechanically. She tasted faintly of wine. But her eyes betrayed hurtulated, restless, too alive. I didn't mention the car I'd seen pull away. Didn't mention the silhouette. Hunters don't shout. They wait. The gaslighting began soon after. "You're quiet lately," she said one night, sipping her wine. "Just tired," I replied. "You always say that." "Maybe I'm always tired." She laughed, but her eyes searched mine. She wanted to know how much I suspected. She wanted to measure me. I let her think I was dull, distracted, docile. The perfect camouflage. The more she lied, the more relaxed she became. She thought my silence was ignorance. She thought her performance was flawless. That was her second mistake. Because I wasn't just listening anymore. I was planning. And every plan needs a climax. I already knew what hers would be. She had written it herself the night she whispered into her lover's phone, begging to be set on fire. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. But on my terms. There is a moment, in every careful operation, when doubt must be neutralized. Doubt is like humidity, it seeps in, fogs your vision, ruins the clean lines of a plan. I couldn't afford fog. The things I had collected, phrases, receipts, a silhouette leaving our driveway, were threads. They would not hang her. I needed a rope. I needed a structure that could hold an accusation and not snap under scrutiny. I needed, above all, certainty. Certainty came slowly, like thawing ice. It was built from repetition and pattern and the kind of patient observation that turns gossip into indictment. I stopped hoping she would trip and started engineering situations where the truth had fewer places to hide. That meant becoming boring, predictable, the man she thought she could take for granted. It also meant learning how to be invisible while still moving pieces across the board. In the early days of preparation, I made lists, not the feverish, scribbled kind you see in movies, but neat columns in a small notebook I kept hidden in the back of my sock drawer. Each entry was clinical: date, time, behavior, corroborating detail. Example: 08/12/2114 unknown male arrival, silhouette, car left at 21:56. No ranting adjectives. No moralizing. Just facts. Precision removes the emotion from memory and places it where it belongs, in evidence. I rehearsed conversations in my head the way an actor rehearses lines. If confronted, she would equivocate. If I accused, she would call it paranoid. If I waited for proof, she might become more careful. Each response had a counter. I practiced patience the way you practice holding a smile. It is easy to unleash fury, it is an art to withhold it until the final curtain. Night by night I tightened my surveillance. Not by breaking into her finino dramatic hacking, no desperate invasions. I refused to become the person I despised. Instead, I cultivated situations where she would reveal herself easily. She loved certain rhythms: the late-night walk with the dog, the Sunday coffee at the corner place, the salon she never skipped. I started joining those rhythms in ways that looked casual. I sat in the coffee shop 2 blocks away and watched the door for the glint of her hair. I walked our dog slightly later than usual and timed my route to pass the back alley she used when she said she was just stretching her legs. I left work when publicity meetings were dull, caught the bus that went past the strip of restaurants where I suspected he might be waiting. You don't have to break your life to spy on someone. You make small alterations that seem incidental and suddenly become the means by which you gather truth. There were moments I liked. They made me feel surgical and not sinister. I shadowed her sometimes at a distance, never close enough to be seen, always close enough to notice the small things: the way her laughter changed when she walked into the arms of a man who was not me, the way her hand bent to be held in a palm that was unfamiliar. Once, I saw them sitting so close at a booth his knee nearly touched hers across the table. She wore the pale rose lipstick me thumb found that smear on the sink a week later, and I remembered the angle of that booth. She looked up at him with that expression I recognized in the photographs of my notebook, the one that hinted at plans and secret jokes. There were also failures. The hunt makes you feel like a god sometimes, until you are shown as merely human by circumstance. I once timed my arrival poorly and found only a deserted table and the barista polishing the espresso machine. I watched her leave with a tote bag and no companion. I waited, heart kicked into a sprint, until finally she turned, alone, and walked into the street. For a moment my mind tried to read benevolence into the scene. Maybe she had been meeting someone earlier and he left. Maybe she was leaving a meeting. Maybe I wanted to give her the benefit of every doubt because I was proud of being reasonable. Then she checked her phone, smiled privately, and the doubt evaporated. When suspicion graduates to strategy, you begin to think in terms of leverage. Leverage is not merely proof, it is the ability to present truth so that it cannot be dismissed. If she denied everything, I wanted a setting where denial would not suffice, where witnesses, context, and undeniable evidence would corral whatever lies she could spin. I plotted scenarios like a chess player, a photographed moment where her lover's car was visible, a recorded message that captured the breathy cadence of "set me on fire" and paired it with a timestamp, a witness who would remember seeing them together. To create such scenes without appearing paranoid takes finesse. You don't stage a spectacle, you engineer opportunities for chance to be on your side. I turned our life into a string of those opportunities. I flirted with predictability and then used it. I invited friends over on evenings I knew she might have plans, friends she would not call suspicious. I made sure the dog needed walks at certain times. I allowed myself to be in places where her patterns intersected with mine. It sounds obvious when I say it now, but the trick was patience. Show up and wait. The truth almost always prefers to bloom if you give it a sunny enough window. I also collected indirect evidence, photos, receipts, fragments of conversation overheard in kitchens and on bus rides. I took snapshots of cars, license plates, a coffee cup with a logo from a district I didn't know she frequented. I kept a copy of the receipt I'd once found in her coat pocket and compared it to the menus of restaurants she preferred. The pieces started to feel less like scraps and more like a narrative. Still, there was a snag I had not fully accounted for, the internal ethical argument that kept circling like a fly in my head. Who was I to orchestrate another person's humiliation? Who was I to set fires even if they were only metaphorical? The line between metamorphosis and monstrosity is small. I confronted this quiet voice by writing down what I had been told, phrases she had taught someone else to use as sex ritual, the nights she had been absent, the receipts that didn't match the life we promised. I told myself that revenge, if it came, would be precise and not cruel for cruelty's sake. It would be a demonstration, not an annihilation. I would exact accountability, I would not maim for sport. So the plan took shape in stages. There would be an exposure that was undeniable, and it would be constructed in a way that left little room for spinning narratives. It would be staged in a public theater, one where the audience would be people whose opinions mattered to her, friends, colleagues, perhaps even family. Public humiliation is a blunt instrument, it satisfies the primal urge for retribution. But it's also messy. The more I thought about it, the more I hated the idea of spectacle for spectacle's sake. I wanted something surgical, an exposure that explained itself without me having to shout. Therefore I chose an approach with three components: observation, corroboration, and confrontation. Observation I had already started. Corroboration meant acquiring independent witnesses or records who could validate my observations. Confrontation, when it came, would not be their first exposure to the truth, it would be a final knot tying together facts they could not deny. The first stage, observation, was almost complete. I had enough to feel secure in the knowledge that my marriage had been trespassed. The second stage, corroboration, would require more cleverness. I needed something she could not erase: time-stamped media, a neutral witness, a physical trace. Cameras were crude and invasive, I resisted them for the same reason I resisted plundering her private messages. There are ways to get evidence without breaking moral codes, I told myself. There are methods that respect boundaries while still seeking truth. I started with the taxi records. In our city, ride-share cars leave temporary markers, locations, and timestamps. I made it a point to be the person who worked remotely once a week at a cafe situated between her salon and a cluster of restaurants. From my seat I could watch the taxi ranks. One evening, at 8:46 p.m., a small gray sedan pulled up in front of a rooftop restaurant. She stepped out, alone, and a man followed. He wore a baseball cap and a scarf. He looked at the woman like a man who owned a piece of territory and expected no dispute. I took a photograph with my phone, not close, not invasive, but close enough. The picture showed her profile, the angle of her jaw, the line of the scarf that matched the sweater I'd seen folded on our couch. In the background, the restaurant's illuminated marquee read the time. It was crude and inadequate as a smoking gun, but it was a piece. I needed a witness who would corroborate without being bought. Friends are unreliable witnesses in matters of infidelity, loyalty bends in odd ways. Family, even less reliable parents forgive what suits them. I needed someone neutral. I found him by accident, an off-duty courier who frequented the area at odd hours and had a camera embedded in his dash. He liked to show me photos of the city's nightlife, the way lights melted into puddles. We had become conversational acquaintances at the cafe. I asked him, casually, if he remembered seeing a gray sedan near the rooftop restaurant on Thursday. He did. He even showed me a grainy photo he had taken while waiting at the light. The grainy photo matched mine, same curvature of a silhouette, same glint of a street lamp. Corroboration, at last. He didn't know the implications. He was amused, and I was relieved. With those two images, the skeleton of a case existed. The third leg, confrontation, remained. Confrontation had to be surgical. It had to collapse her lies inward without turning me into a villain. I imagined a meeting where the truth was undeniable, her laughter on a recording, a time-stamped pattern of meetings, a photo of a lover leaving our home. But each of those options had sweep and risk. If I presented audio without consent, I risked being accused of invasion. If I leaked images, I risked drag that would scar more than it would correct. So I evolved the plan into something that involved inertia rather than direct violence, a staged reallocation of social narrative. I would construct a scenario that invited her to perform her betrayal public lie in her own terms so that her performance would be witness to her undoing. There is something perversely brilliant about a confession given with confidence. It cannot be easily recanted when the room is full and faces search for truth. To get her to perform to become brazen enough to speak freely in front of others, I needed two things: an audience and the illusion of impunity. For that, I had to rebuild her sense of invulnerability. If she believed she was untouchable, she would slip. I fed that belief by being docile, by pretending I still trusted her, by feeding her the little comforts that made hubris blossom. Small compliments, a casual openness, the kind of marital warmth that lulls. I became a convincing actor, the bored husband, the man who had nothing to fear. At the same time, I moved pieces into place. I arranged a dinner with couples we knew, a work celebration that she would find irresistible. I arranged it on a night I suspected her lover might be around. I placed mutual friends in the room, people whose opinions she valued. I made sure the setting held the right mix of intimacy and audience. And because plans are never perfect, I built contingencies. If he did not show, the evening would still host a particular conversation. I would steer the talk using subtle prompts, questions that taste like concern and land like traps. There was an element of cruelty in my enjoyment. I admit it without shame, the construction of the plan thrilled me. Not because I wanted to hurt her for the sake of hurting, but because I wanted to dismantle the lies with such clean strokes that she would have no refuge. This was not a pubic lashing. It was an argument with a visible transcript and narrative where each sentence could be checked. I imagined the moment she would realize that the room, like the city, had been watching her all along. Still, the breaking point, the moment of action, was not yet scheduled. Plans, I knew, must be timed with precision. Rushing makes messes. Waiting allows the world to perform itself. I had to be patient a little longer. I had to get more corroboration, another picture, a restaurant receipt, perhaps the luxury of a voicemail that echoed the phrase I'd heard in the bedroom. I wanted her words to be the spearhead of her undoing, because she had chosen those words with delicious thoughtlessness. On a rain-pale Tuesday, months after the first overheard call, she came home late, dripping and breathless, eyes flaming bright as if from a secret that warmed her. I folded my newspaper and watched her move through the apartment, cataloguing the angles of her shoulders, the cadence of her footsteps. She kissed me on the cheek and came into the kitchen. I offered her tea, and she accepted with the absent air of someone who has already done something dangerous and delightful. "You're home late," I said lightly, as if the sentence was a benign observation and not lit tinder. "Just work," she said, and her hand moved to her phone when she said it. Habit, I thought. Avoidance, I thought. Evasion. The notebook in my sleeve was becoming comfortable like a new muscle. My hands didn't tremble when I wrote. The plan was forming a final outline in my head: more evidence, a room full of witnesses, and a confrontation that would force her to reconcile what she had been privately demanding with what she would have to face publicly. There would be no shouting. There would be no dramatic, messy violence. There would be exposure and the collapse of performance. That, in my careful mind, was justice. I slept with a clear thought that night. I had crossed the line between suspicion and action. The tools of my revenge were not torches and threats. They were discipline, patience, and the quiet development of a narrative that would reveal what she had already given away. She would not know it when she laughed next in a booth across town. She would not know it when she slipped the pale lipstick into our bag and forgot. The world has a way of telling truth if you are willing to listen long enough and work quietly to ensure others hear it too. The breaking point, then, was less an inciting terror than a settled decision. I would not go back to the man who had once allowed himself to be deceived out of comfort. I would not be the bewildered husband who raised his voice and then went home empty-handed. I had chosen a strategy, and I would see it through. I would be surgical. I would be patient. I would be precise. And when the moment came, when the room would lean in and the fabric would peel back to reveal what had been sewn under it, I would watch the performance of her undoing with steady eyes, collecting each small piece of confirmation like a professional appraiser. I would not take pleasure in her pain, I would take pleasure in truth being given its due. The rest, the ash, the aftermath, the new maps of my life would be things I could wait for. For now, the plan was set in skeletal form. The next steps were simple: gather the last pieces of corroboration, construct the evening that would draw out her confidence, and ensure that when she performed into witness. The last part would require Nervesto stand in a room and watch your life as collateral, and I would have to be braver than I'd ever been. Bravery here was the willingness to stay and watch, not to run. Bravery was accepting the consequences of truth once it was unleashed. It was, in the end, a strange sort of mercy. You give someone the chance to speak openly, and you allow the truth to choose them. That would be my way. That would be my strategy. The breaking point was not a scream, it was the quiet turn where everything became inevitable. They say patience is a virtue, but patience in my hands was a weapon. It was the scalpel I honed daily, the knife that would cut her mask from her face without spilling unnecessary blood. By now, I had enough evidence to know beyond doubt what she was doing. What I lacked was the precise moment when her confidence would blind her, when her lies would crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. And so, I began to build the theater. I invited her into safety. That was the first step. A guilty person expects suspicion, expects confrontation, expects the storm. What they don't expect is calm skies, tender gestures, and the illusion of forgiveness. That's why predators lull prey, because nothing makes a person reckless like comfort. I kissed her more often, casually, as though I were rediscovering the marriage. I complimented her outfits, feigned interest in her latest projects, asked if she wanted to try new restaurants together. She smiled, a little uncertain at first, but quickly relaxed into the warmth. She believed my suspicion if she ever sensed it had cooled. She thought she had one. That was exactly what I needed. Because arrogance breeds mistakes. The first trap was social. I began setting up dinners and gathering small ones at first, friends we both knew. I wanted her to reacquaint herself with the feeling of invulnerability, the sense that she could charm and lie her way through any scrutiny. And she did. She laughed easily, leaned against me, held my hand for effect. To everyone watching, we looked like a happy couple rediscovering their spark. But I watched her eyes. I watched how they flickered to her phone under the table, how her fingers twitched when a vibration hummed in her purse. I saw her pupils widen when she read a message, the kind of involuntary dilation that belongs not to friendship but to lust. And I smiled. I let her have her illusion. The second trap was logistical. I altered my routine subtly, invisibly. I told her I'd be working late on certain days, but instead I parked 2 streets over from her usual haunts. I left home early for meetings but doubled back quietly, noting how quickly she scurried to her phone once she thought I was gone. Each variation tightened the net. Each alteration gave me a better map of her movements, a clearer picture of when and where she felt safest to betray me. The third trap was psychological. I planted ideas in conversation casual, passing mentions that would later bloom into strategies. I suggested we throw a dinner party for close friends, maybe even colleagues. We've been so wrapped up in ourselves, I told her warmly, we should reconnect with people. She lit up at the suggestion because nothing thrilled her more than an audience. She loved to perform, to play the charming wife. She didn't realize I was building her stage. By now, the phrase I had overheard, "set me on fire," burned in my skull like scripture. It had become more than words, it was prophecy. She had said it with such hunger, such careless desire, that she had unknowingly given me the exact metaphor I needed. And so, I decided, her fire would be granted. Not in flames that consumed flesh, but in exposure that consumed reputation, comfort, and the fragile scaffolding of lies she clung to. She wanted heat, passion, danger. She would get it. But first, I needed one more layer of certainty. I reached out to a few key people, mutual friends who trusted me, who had no reason to suspect the darkness swirling beneath my calm. I told them I wanted to surprise her with something special at the upcoming dinner, that I needed their help to make it memorable. They agreed easily. People love to play accomplice to romance, especially when they believe they're helping a husband reignite love. I prepared the setting meticulously. The dinner would be intimate, 8 people, close enough that silence could be weaponized, large enough that witnesses would exist. The dining room would be staged perfectly, warm lighting, soft music, wine flowing freely. I wanted her relaxed, confident, unguarded. And in the center of it all, I would place my trap. I won't yet describe how I engineered a small recorder tucked beneath the couch, the phone call I had intercepted, the innocuous seeming game I would propose at the table, but every detail was accounted for. I didn't need to expose her with rage or violence. I needed her to expose herself. The hardest part was playing the role of doting husband convincingly in the days leading up to it. I had to sleep beside her, listen to her laugh, feel her lips brush mine, all while knowing what she had done, what she continued to do. My rage was a living thing, coiled beneath my ribs, whispering for release. But I suppressed it, because timing is everything. I cooked for her, poured her wine, asked about her day. She rewarded me with stories that were half-truths, polished lies meant to distract. She thought she was manipulating me. She thought she had mastered the art of deception. But really, she was just deepening her investment in the performance, making the eventual collapse that much more catastrophic. The night before the dinner, I stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the simmering pot of salsa on the stove. The smell should have reminded me of comfort, of Sunday afternoons when life was simpler. Instead, it reminded me of betrayal. It reminded me of the phone call I had overheard, the obscene request she had made to her lover. I stirred the pot slowly, deliberately, letting the spoon circle like a pendulum. I thought about fire. About cleansing. About how easily something beautiful could be transformed into something scalding. Tomorrow, I told myself, she would burn. Not literally. But completely. And so, the stage was set. The guests invited. The evidence waiting. My performance ready. She thought it was a dinner party. I knew it was the beginning of her execution. Dinner parties are rituals dressed as hospitality. They are an economy of glances and small performances, a place where reputations are minted and reminted over hors d'oeuvres and polite laughter. I had cultivated this particular evening like a vintner tends a barrel, control the temperature, the light, the guests, and the fermentation does the rest. By the time the first car rolled onto our street, everything smelled of citrus and candle wax, precise, controlled. I greeted the first guests at the door with a smile that felt like a mask I'd been practicing for months. They arrived in pairs, colleagues, 2 couples from our book club, a neighbor whose gossip was subtle and acute, and Jonah, a professional friend who taught communications and had a talent for coaxing truth out of people with a single, well-placed question. I had invited Jonah for that reason. He would be useful. People like him are surgical with conversation. They know how to pry without seeming to pry. Good to see you, I said to each person, shaking hands, guiding coats onto hooks. My wife stood by me in a dress that skimmed her silhouette, one she'd choose to be noticed in, I knew. She moved through the room like someone polishing a statue, bright and practiced. When she saw me smile, she returned it with the warmth she used in public, the exact same warmth she used earlier with the new man who'd been choosing our booths. The dining room was arranged with deliberate intimacy. I had moved the table closer to the fireplace, lit candles that would soften faces but also throw shadows into the right places. My plan relied on the kind of atmosphere that encourages confession, relaxed, perhaps a little wine high, the sense that we were all comfortable friends sharing one more story before the night concluded. We ate. We tasted. Conversation ambled, the latest news, small talk about the office, the kind of safe topics that let people feel like they were still inside the rules. My wife laughed often and with a practiced looseness, leaning into compliments from the others. She was good at this. She had been practicing social performance before I ever suspected she was practicing something else. Jonah sat across from her. I watched the way his eyes tracked her as if cataloging the angle at which she folded her napkin. He asked the usual questions, then, like a casual surgeon, reached for one that would later be an incision. So, how have you both been recently? Jonah asked, and his eyes lingered on her in a way that seemed to ask for more than the polite answer. Really been busy. Any new projects? She smiled. Work has been hectic, she said, and the word swept over her like a shield. Lots of client deadlines. You know how it is. Her fingers toyed with the stem of her wine glass, turning the liquid like a small planet. It's funny, Jonah said, his voice light. You can always tell when something's off in a marriage by the way people talk about their work. Work becomes a refuge. Or a weapon. Heads tilted like small birds. The neighbor chuckled uneasily. My wife's smile faltered for the first time, just a fraction, and it was the fraction I had banked on. I let the silence sit there a moment longer than was polite, keeping my face neutral. I felt Jonah's question land and then retreat, like a practiced diver testing the water. She's been amazing, I said, casually, as if the thought had just occurred to me. Committed. Busy. The words were fact-true and useful. I noticed the small relief in her posture. She heard the defense in my voice and relaxed. Perhaps she believed I had no reason to suspect anything. As the evening moved, so did Willaughter, toasts, a couple of jests about a mutual friend's recent misadventures. I poured more wine into glasses. There is a certain lubricating honesty alcohol provides without guaranteeing any particular confession. That is the risk of such evenings. But risk, in my plan, was a calculated element. People become loose, their defenses fray. Lies prefer loose fabric. At the midpoint, when plates were cleared and coffee was being poured, Jonah initiated one of his conversational exercises. It was a harmless game to the rest of the tableau, a little prompt to share something you wouldn't tell your high school self. It was benign, and that was its brilliance. People who conceal keep a smaller set of true things in their pockets, games invite the pocket to open. Let's play a game, Jonah said, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. Tell us one secret or a truth you wouldn't tell your younger self. Heads tilted again, indulgent. People like to reveal but in measured doses. They enjoy the illusion of transparency. My wife brightened, she loved to narrate herself. She had always been good at choosing which truths to whisper and which to gouge out with the false intimacy of a staged monologue. She began with an anecdote about a bad haircut in college, something harmless that drew laughter. Then another person offered a mildly embarrassing truth about an ex. The mood widened, the room softened. My wife's confidence grew. She drank, told stories, made the table bend toward her. She was, in every way, performing a life that excluded what she had been doing in secret. And that performance mattered. Public narrative is sticky, once stated, it adheres. At some point, Jonah pivoted without it being obvious. Okay, he said, leaning forward as if in on a smaller joke, what about something that's complicated? A temptation? A choice you're not proud of? His tone was both an invitation and a lockpick. Her eyes darted at me for a sliver, looking for a cue, a permission. I gave none. My silence was my accomplice. She saw no danger in the room, that was the essential miscalculation I had ensured. She laughed it off at first, then said, temptations are boring. I'm more of a risk person. She spoke the phrase with that dangerous, theatrical inflection she used to get men's attention and friends' envy. She loved being admired for her edges. The comment landed like a pebble. Jonah smirked in the way of a man who has noticed a fissure and is deciding whether to widen it. You're a risk person. Jonah repeated, friendly. Tell us about a time you took a risk. She told a story, elegant, self-contained, about a business decision in which she had chosen an unconventional strategy that had succeeded. She made it heroic. The table applauded politely. I watched, unflinching. The story was not the one that mattered. The neighbor, who had less appetite for games, attempted to shift the conversation, said something about the weather, but Jonah persisted. He threaded questions with care, like a surgeon coaxing a confession through comfortable distraction. To play devil's advocate, Jonah said, if someone asked you to do something dangerous, for pleasure, would you? A murmur ran. Glasses paused. The flicker of the candle cast different angles across faces. Her cheeks flushed not from shyness but because she was enjoying the direction this was taking. She turned to him, smiling. Depends on what dangerous means, she said. Sometimes danger is just heat. Heat. The word lodged there, soft and ordinary, but it carried the smell of the phrase I'd heard months ago. Set me on fire. The memory grazed me like smoke. I kept my expression neutral. Jonah's mouth tipped into a smile that was just a crease of curiosity, now nothing more. He had no idea of the infernal echo that sat under the surface of that word. The neighbor cleared his throat, trying once again to steer the group toward safer shores. No one listened. The room had become a small theater, and my wife enjoyed being the leading actress. Her guard, loosened by wine and laughs, began to slip in ways I needed it to. At some point the conversation turned to travel. Someone mentioned a retreat that had been wildly successful for Caplace, a weekend where people explored intimacy and performed scenarios. The idea received polite skepticism and then indulgent curiosity. My wife leaned in, her fingers laced around her cup. That sounds incredible, she said. I've read about those. She spoke like someone with a secret itinerary. It was then I executed a move I had rehearsed but never discussed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming envelope. It was marked with a local cafe's logo, one she frequented. My hand rested on the table where she could see it. For the briefest second she glanced toward my palm, interest flickering across her face. Then she returned to the conversation, smoothed her smile, and slid the thought of the envelope away. Open it, Jonah said, casual and light as mortar. It's like a story prop. Why not? Everyone smirked, a chorus of indulgence. The neighbor laughed. My wife, radiant as a woman on stage, rolled her eyes and extended a hand. She reached for the envelope with a performance-ready curiosity that would have been charming in any other context. Inside was a small card, an innocuous invitation to a community talk on relationships, nothing scandalous. The joke landed well. People chuckled. She held the card up like a prop and joked about how romantic it sounded. No harm done. The laughter returned. But seeds had been planted. Jonah's questions had irrigated the ground, her casual responses had provided fertilizer. People had been reminded, gently, of that one dangerous word he'd spoken into the warm quiet of our dining room. She had heard it in a public context now, against the background noise of agreeable friends. The notion had been made less of a private manuscript and more of a public footnote. As the evening wound down and the last of the coffee was poured, a message buzzed across her phone. She checked it with the practiced nonchalance of someone who has been trained by secrecy to look innocent. The screen showed a name one I knew but still could not pronounce without a small, private bitterness. She smiled, and the smile was not for me. She rose to leave briefly to take the call, and in that moment, the room hummed with the kind of exposure I had orchestrated without anyone noticing it had been orchestrated. She stood in the hallway, phone held to her ear. The light caught at the back of her neck, at the line where hair met skin. It was a profile I had studied in a million frames. She was beautiful in the way people are when they assume the world is their audience. She spoke, laughing softly. The tone was different than her public voice, breathier, more intimate. A sound, harmless and private, slid through the doorway and landed in the living room like a small, sharp stone. I felt a small, precise satisfaction, not cruelty, but the intake of air a diver takes before the plunge. The plan was working. The people I had chosen for the room had loosened their own defenses, becoming inadvertent collaborators in a theater I controlled. She was performing, and in that performance her slips became visible, like a stain showing through a white shirt when held against a lamp. When she returned, she was still smiling but now slightly off balance. Her hands moved with the awareness of someone who had been interrupted mid-ritual. She sat down across from me and caught my eye. There was a question there, a tiny suspicion had I known about the message, and I let it pass. I said nothing. She took a breath and tried to re-enter the public play. We folded the evening into a comfortable conclusion: hugs, goodbyes, promises to do it again soon. Our guests departed into the cool night, leaving the apartment scented with lemon and the residue of conversation. I walked each couple to the door with the same practiced warmth. My wife kissed me as she often did in public, the gesture for the cameras that kept the world thinking everything was intact. After the last car left and the house settled into that odd hush that arrives after enforced sociability, we sat with the dog at our feet. The adrenaline that had been humming below my skin slowly ebbed into a steady, watchful calm. I poured 2 glasses of the leftover wine and handed one to her. She accepted, curling into herself like someone who has not yet processed the shape of what they've done. Did you have fun? I asked, plain as a kitchen clock. She smiled, elusive. Yes. It was nice. I liked Jonah's questions. I watched the way the candlelight outlined the base of her throat, the way her eyes shifted away when she said it. The thrill the evening had given her was visible, like a faint glow. She had been entertained. She had been aroused by the feeling of not being contained. She had left traces. For all her carefulness, she could not help herself. Good, I said. I'm glad. She sipped her wine, and for the first time I saw real fatigue cross her features, the heavy sort that follows someone who has been living double time. It was a small human thing, and for a nanosecond I felt pity before the plan's final movement reasserted itself. I had everything I needed for the next step: the witnesses had been primed, her performance had been public, and the seeds of the phrase heat, danger had been nudged into the room. All that remained was to make the phrase stick where it would do the most damage, the place where she couldn't charm it away. The reveal would require an instrument delicate enough to pierce and loud enough to be undeniable. I had arranged for that instrument. I had thought about sound, how it carries and how it betrays. For now, I kept the detail to myself because strategy survives in secrecy. But the plan had moved to its last gear. The evening had done what my months of surveillance could not. It had loosened her tongue in public and planted doubt in the minds of others, who would soon understand the context she thought she owned. She finished her wine and set the glass down. "We should do that again," she said, smiling like a woman who expected the world to continue giving her stage after stage. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. "We should." It was the last time for a while she would be able to say that without reservation. The next occasions would be different, watched, measured, and heavy with the weight of facts she could no longer deny. The trap had tightened, the night had done its work. The show, properly staged, was about to enter its final act. The house was quiet the next morning, but I was not. My mind hummed like a machine, each gear in place, each lever pulled by the events of the night before. The dinner party had not been the climax, it had been the overture. She thought it was a gathering of friends, I knew it was a rehearsal. The real performance was coming. I had been planning the reveal for weeks, refining it until it was airtight. No shouting match. No gotcha scene of childish rage. Now what I had in mind was precision, inevitability. A stage on which she would expose herself without realizing, and a room full of witnesses who could never unsee what they'd heard. The tool was simple. Sound. Months earlier, when I first heard her squeal on the phone about wanting her lover to set her on fire, I knew the phrase was too grotesque, too distinct to ignore. It stuck in my mind, replaying like a cursed refrain. I needed her to repeat it. I needed it to exist outside my memory, captured and undeniable. And so, I waited, engineered moments, and when I finally caught her whispering it again into her phone one night when she thought I was asleep, I had the recorder running. Her words, her voice. Crisp. Breathless. Begging. That recording was my matchstick. The setting for the reveal had to matter. A confrontation in private would lead to denial, gaslighting, excuses. She'd twist it, claim I'd fabricated it, accuse me of paranoia. Not his required an audience. Not strangers, but people whose opinions pierced her armor, friends, colleagues, the circle she craved approval from. I set it in motion under the guise of another dinner, just a week after the first. The same group, plus 2 new faces, one of her colleagues she desperately admired, and Jonah again, the man with the gift of drawing confessions. She would not suspect anything, after all, hadn't the last gathering gone so well? Hadn't I been the perfect husband, doting and attentive? She even kissed me before the guests arrived, whispering, "I love when we host like this." If she only knew. The night unfolded like the first: wine, food, laughter. But beneath the chatter was a taut wire only I could hear. Every smile she gave, every toss of her hair, every coy glance at her phony, it all tightened the coil inside me. After dessert, when conversation lulled into that warm, drowsy openness that wine and candlelight create, I struck. "Jonah," I said casually, "last time you had us all sharing truths. That was fun." He grinned. "Should we play again?" A chorus of indulgent agreement rippled around the table. My wife smiled, eager for the spotlight again. This time, I was the one to suggest the twist. "How about we make it more interesting? Instead of us just telling, we listen. I have something queued up. A little experiment in honesty." I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. Her eyes flicked to it instantly, a shadow crossing her face so fast only I would notice. "Don't worry," I said with a light chuckle, "it's nothing bad. Just something I came across the other day. Thought it'd make for good discussion." I pressed play. Her voice filled the room. "God, I want you to set my ass on fire." There it was. Clear. Breathless. Her words, unmistakable. The room went still. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Jonah's eyebrows lifted. The neighbor blinked rapidly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The colleague she admired turned his head sharply, staring at her with a mix of shock and curiosity. My wife's face drained of color. I let the silence stretch, savoring it like the pause before a guillotine falls. Then I spoke, calm, almost conversational. Strange, isn't it? To hear your wife begging another man for that kind of thing. Strange how certain words stick with you. The table was silent, the air heavy. She stammered, tried to laugh it off. That's Noti don't know how. But denial collapses when faced with undeniable proof. I tapped the phone, replaying the clip. Her voice again, moaning, pleading. No mistaking it. No editing, no fabrication. I leaned back, folding my hands. You thought I didn't notice. You thought while I was stirring salsa in the kitchen, you could slip away and play with whoever you wanted. But I noticed everything. And tonight so does everyone else. The collapse was exquisite. Her mask cracked in front of her peers. The admired colleague shifted uncomfortably, clearly re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about her. The neighbor looked away, embarrassed to be in the room. Jonah studied her, eyes sharp, as though cataloging the anatomy of her undoing. She tried again, desperate now, that's taken out of context. I cut her off. My voice was still calm, surgical. What context, exactly, redeems that? What context explains begging another man to do what you never even whispered to me in 10 years of marriage? Her mouth opened, then closed. No answer. Only silence. And then the whispers started. Among the guests. Small, disbelieving murmurs. The kind that spread faster than fire. Exactly as I had planned. I had promised myself this wouldn't become a scene of rage. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't curse. I would simply, expose. And in exposure, let her burn. I raised my glass, as though making a toast. To honesty, I said softly. And to finally seeing people for who they really are. I drank. The others followed hesitantly. My wife sat frozen, eyes glassy, her hands trembling against the tablecloth. She had wanted fire. She got it. And I gave them one hell of a show. The house felt cavernous once the last guest left. The echoes of their shoes against the floorboards lingered longer than the goodbyes, and when the door finally shut behind the final pair of uncomfortable witnesses, the silence fell heavy. It wasn't peacy, it was the silence of a battlefield after the last shot has been fired, smoke still curling above corpses. She sat at the dining table where I had left her, pale, trembling, eyes wet. The same woman who had paraded herself through life with poise and charm was now small, diminished, stripped of her illusions. She opened her mouth once, as though to speak, but the sound caught in her throat and died. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Silence was part of her punishment. The phone buzzed, first hers, not mine. A message, then another. Guests already whispering, already circling the carcass of her reputation like vultures. Jonah had left without a word, but I could imagine him recounting every detail later, dissecting her collapse with relish. The admired colleague, her mentor, her lifeline to a professional world she cherished, had barely met my eyes on his way out. She would not walk into her office on Monday the same woman who had left it on Friday. She knew it too. I saw it dawning in her vacant stare. She whispered finally, a ragged attempt, why would you do that to me? I almost laughed. The question was absurd. But I held my composure, voice even. Why did you do that to us? Her tears came then, but they were not the kind that begged forgiveness. They were selfish tears, the kind people cry when the mask is gone and the world sees their rot. She wasn't mourning me, or our marriage. She was mourning herself. I made a mistake, she sobbed. No, I corrected, calm as a surgeon. You made a choice. And then you made it again. And again. And tonight, you lived with it. She reached for me, hand trembling, desperate for even a fraction of the old safety she thought she'd always have. I stepped back. Her fingers closed on empty air. You could have just left, she whispered. I could have, I agreed. But you didn't want me to leave. You wanted me here faithful, loyal while you played with fire. You wanted me as your shield. Tonight, I took that shield away. Now the world sees you for what you are. She crumpled into the chair, sobbing harder. The sound was hollow to me, background noise. As I walked into the kitchen, the smell of salsa still lingered. That same scent, tied to the night everything cracked. A domestic comfort turned into a trigger. I leaned on the counter, staring at the simmer-stained stove, and for the first time in months, I felt steady. Betrayal has a way of hollowing a man out. Of making him question whether he's blind, weak, or foolish. But tonight, I'd answered those questions. I wasn't blind. I wasn't weak. And I wasn't foolish. I had watched. I had waited. And I had delivered. She wanted fire. I gave her one. Not the kind that warms, but the kind that consumes until nothing is left but ash. When I finally returned to the dining room, she had gone upstairs, retreating into whatever den of shame she could crawl into. I didn't follow. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I gathered the wine glasses, the empty plates, the crumbs of a night that would live forever in the whispers of our friends. Every clink of glass into the sink felt final, like the tolling of bells at a funeral. Because that's what it was. Not the funeral of a woman, not even of a marriage. It was the funeral of lies. And I was the one who buried them. That night, I slept soundly. For the first time in years, the bed did not feel like a stage where pretense was performed. It was simply a bed, mine alone. By morning, the whispers would spread further. Her colleagues, her family, maybe even her love reach would hear fragments of the truth. And she would have to live with it. I would move on. Scarred, perhaps, but free. And she? She would remain in the ruins she built for herself, choking on the smoke of the fire she begged for. People often ask if revenge brings closure. The truth? It doesn't erase the betrayal, doesn't make the wound vanish. But it cauterizes it. It stops the bleeding. And as I stood there the next morning, watching sunlight cut through the kitchen window, I realized something. I was no longer her husband. I was the man who had survived her fire. And I walked away unburned.